Welcome to ShadowLore. Today, we'll be sharing 7 true scary hotel stories. These tales reveal the dark secrets and eerie encounters hidden within seemingly innocent hotels. Let's get started. Story 1. The Room That Shouldn't Exist. After a grueling 12-hour drive, I finally found a place to stop. It wasn't ideal, just a small, family-owned hotel off the highway. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I didn't care. I was exhausted. My eyes were struggling to stay open, and all I could think about was collapsing onto a bed. The receptionist was an old man, well into his 70s, with deep wrinkles that etched his face like a map of time. He barely acknowledged me as I checked in, simply handing over an old brass key with the number 304 engraved on it. His indifference didn't bother me, though. I wasn't looking for conversation. I just needed sleep. As I walked through the dimly lit hallway, the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. The carpets were faded and worn, with stains that hinted at long-forgotten spills. It smelled faintly of mold and dust, but again, I didn't care. My mind was on autopilot, focused solely on reaching my room. When I opened the door to room 304, the first thing that hit me was the chill. It was colder than the rest of the hotel. I glanced around, noticing the outdated furnishings. A small bed with floral sheets, a wooden dresser, and a nightstand with a flickering lamp. The walls were covered in faded floral wallpaper that looked like it had seen better days, decades ago. Despite the cold, I kicked off my shoes and fell onto the bed. My body was sore from the long drive, and the mattress, though lumpy, felt like heaven. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. Something about the room felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. My brain kept nagging at me, telling me something wasn't right. But I pushed the feeling aside, convincing myself it was just my exhaustion playing tricks on me. Eventually, I drifted off, but my sleep was anything but peaceful. I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with a deep, unsettling feeling in the pit of my stomach. The room was pitch black, except for the faint light seeping in through the curtains. I checked my phone. It was 2:47 a.m. My throat was parched, so I got up to get some water from the bathroom. That's when I saw it. There was a door in the corner of the room that hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. When I checked in, the room had only one door, the one leading to the hallway. But now, in the corner, half hidden by shadows, was another door. A door that looked old and worn, with peeling paint and a rusted handle. I stood frozen, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't noticed it before. Maybe I was too tired to see it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. That door hadn't been there when I first entered the room. Something about it was deeply wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were cemented to the floor. The air in the room had shifted, becoming thick and suffocating. It was like the walls were closing in, trapping me. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that door, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on it the entire time. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like a scared child. My heart was still racing, and I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the fear. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept glancing over at the door, half expecting it to open on its own, but it didn't. It just sat there, looming in the corner, casting a long, dark shadow across the room. When morning finally came, I jumped out of bed, eager to leave the room. But as I glanced around in the daylight, the door was gone. There was no second door in the corner. The room was exactly as it had been when I first entered. One door, one window. I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. Had I imagined it? Maybe I had been dreaming. But the fear I had felt was too real. It had to have been real. I grabbed my things and hurried downstairs, eager to check out and get back on the road. At the reception desk, the same old man was sitting there, reading a newspaper. He didn't even glance up as I approached. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is there anything strange about room 304? The man finally looked up, his eyes narrowing as he studied me. He didn't say anything for a long moment, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest again. "Room 304? He asked, his voice low and gravelly. "That room's been closed off for years." I blinked in confusion. "What do you mean? I stayed there last night." The old man's expression hardened. "That room's been sealed off since the 80s. No one stayed there in decades." I felt a chill run down my spine. "But I have the key." I pulled the brass key out of my pocket and held it up. The old man's face went pale. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process. "Where did you get that key?" he demanded. "You gave it to me last night," I replied, feeling a growing sense of dread. He shook his head slowly, his hands trembling. "That key was lost over 30 years ago." I didn't wait to hear more. I bolted out of the hotel and drove away as fast as I could. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? But as I reached into my pocket later that day, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was the key. The same old brass key with the number 304 engraved on it. I tossed it out the window and never looked back. Story 2. The Night Shift. It was supposed to be a straightforward job. A simple night shift at a mid-tier hotel, watching over the front desk, checking in late arrivals, and making sure nothing went wrong. I'd worked nights before at other places, but this hotel had a reputation for being strange. Some of the other staff mentioned things: lights flickering, objects moving on their own, and whispers in the hallways when no one was around. I brushed it off as typical night shift paranoia. After all, when you're alone in a quiet hotel at 2 a.m., your mind tends to wander. I took the job without hesitation. The pay was decent, and it was only 3 nights a week. The hotel itself was small, tucked away in a quiet part of town, and had a mix of business travelers and the occasional tourist. It was the kind of place people stayed at because it was convenient, not because they wanted to. The building was old, but it had been renovated so many times that the cracks in its history were mostly hidden behind fresh paint and modern furniture. My first few shifts were uneventful. The lobby was empty most of the night, and the guests who did come in were tired, barely sparing a word as they grabbed their keys and headed to their rooms. The hardest part was staying awake during the slow hours between midnight and 4 a.m. The quiet could be oppressive, but I was used to it. I always brought a book or something to keep my mind occupied. It was on my 4th shift that things started to change. I was sitting behind the desk, scrolling through my phone, when I heard the elevator ding. It was a sound I'd grown accustomed to, but something about it felt different this time. The lobby had been empty for hours, and I hadn't checked anyone in since around 9 p.m. I glanced at the monitor that showed the feed from the security cameras, expecting to see someone stepping out of the elevator, but the doors opened to nothing. The hallway was empty. I sat up, my eyes fixed on the screen. Maybe the elevator had malfunctioned. It was an old building after all, and things like that happened. I tried to ignore the chill that crept up my spine as I returned to scrolling through my phone. Then, the elevator dinged again. This time, I stood up, walking around the desk to get a clear view of the elevator. The doors slid open slowly, revealing the same empty space. I stared at it for a long moment, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the elevator remained empty. I was about to head back to my seat when I saw it. A shadow moved across the lobby. It was quick, just a flicker in the corner of my eye, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I turned, scanning the lobby for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No one was there. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning, I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. I was tired, that was all. My mind was playing tricks on me. I returned to the desk, forcing myself to focus on anything else. But the strange occurrences didn't stop. About an hour later, as I was finishing up some paperwork, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing down the hallway that led to the guest rooms. I froze, my pen hovering over the paper, straining to listen. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to stop just outside the lobby. I stood up, my heart racing, and stepped out from behind the desk. The hallway was empty. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the footsteps to start again, but they never did. The hotel was silent. I considered calling someone, one of the other staff members, or maybe even security. But what would I say? That I was hearing things? That the elevator was opening on its own? They'd think I was losing it. I decided to finish my shift without making a fuss. Whatever was happening, it wasn't my problem. As long as the guests were safe, I could handle a few strange noises. But then, at around 3 a.m., something happened that I couldn't ignore. The phone rang. It startled me at first because the phone at the front desk rarely rang, especially not in the middle of the night. I picked it up, expecting to hear the voice of a guest complaining about something trivial. But there was no voice, just heavy breathing. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. "Is anyone there?" The breathing continued, slow and rhythmic, but no one answered. I hung up, my hands trembling. I tried to tell myself it was probably a prank call, maybe some drunk guest playing a joke, but something about it didn't feel right. Not even a minute later, the phone rang again. This time I hesitated before answering, staring at the phone as it rang over and over. Finally, I picked it up. The breathing was back, louder this time. "Who is this?" I demanded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. There was a long pause, and then finally a voice. "They're coming for you." I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. I wanted to leave, to get out of that hotel and never come back, but I was the only staff member on duty. I couldn't just abandon my post. I sat behind the desk, my eyes glued to the lobby, waiting for something, anything to happen. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an hour. I kept glancing at the elevator, half expecting it to ding again, but it remained silent. Then, at 3:33 a.m., the phone rang one last time. I didn't answer it. I couldn't. My hand hovered over the receiver, but I was too scared to pick it up. After a few rings, it stopped, and the lobby fell silent again. I didn't sleep when I got home that morning. I kept thinking about the voice on the phone, the footsteps in the hallway, and the shadow that had passed through the lobby. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just overtired and my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something wrong with that hotel, something dark, and I wasn't the only one who had felt it. I quit the job after that. I couldn't bring myself to go back for another shift. The manager called me a few times, asking why I wasn't coming in, but I never gave him a straight answer. How could I? It's been months since that night, but I still think about it sometimes. I still hear the voice in my head whispering, "They're coming for you." And every time I walk past a hotel, I can't help but wonder if they ever did. Story 3. Room 307. It was the kind of town you'd drive through without even realizing, the sort where the main street looks almost like it had been frozen in time. Small brick buildings lined the road, their faded facades advertising forgotten businesses, an old diner, a barber shop, and a couple of rundown antique stores. It was the last place you'd expect to find a hotel. But I wasn't in any position to be picky. The Riverside Hotel stood on the edge of this forgotten town, nestled against a thick line of trees that looked like they'd been there for centuries. The building itself wasn't much to look at. Tall, narrow, and painted a dull beige color that had long since faded from exposure to the elements. But after 10 hours on the road, I wasn't exactly in the mood for luxury. All I needed was a bed for the night. I checked in around 9 p.m. The lobby was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on your ears, making every little sound seem unnaturally loud. The woman behind the desk had an odd smile, a little too wide, and her eyes were dull and lifeless. I remember how she handed me the key, an actual metal key, not a card, and mumbled something about room 307. I should have noticed something was off right then, but exhaustion has a way of dulling your senses. The elevator creaked as it took me to the 3rd floor. When the doors slid open, the hallway was dim, lit only by a few weak lights spaced too far apart. The wallpaper was peeling, the carpet was threadbare, and there was that smell, an old, musty scent that reminded me of damp basements and forgotten places. But again, I ignored it. I had one goal in mind: get to the room, crash, and leave first thing in the morning. Room 307 was at the far end of the hall, the last door before a dead end. The door itself looked older than the others, with scratches near the handle as if it had been forced open one too many times. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about it felt wrong. But I pushed the feeling aside, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was average. A queen-sized bed, a small desk, a TV mounted on the wall that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The air felt thick, almost stifling, and the same musty odor from the hallway lingered here too. But after a long day on the road, I didn't care. I threw my bag on the floor, kicked off my shoes, and headed straight for the bathroom to wash off the grime from the drive. It wasn't until I was brushing my teeth that I noticed the mirror. There was a crack running across the top, almost like a spider web, but that wasn't the strange part. As I leaned in closer, I realized the reflection was off. The room behind me didn't look quite right. The light seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper, and for just a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the reflection. A dark shape, barely visible, lurking in the corner. I turned around quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. But the room was empty. Of course it was. I was alone. Still, the unease settled in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I chalked it up to exhaustion and tried to push the thought away. After all, it was just a hotel room. What could possibly be wrong? I crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. The mattress was hard, the pillows thin, but I didn't care. My eyelids were heavy, and within minutes I was drifting off to sleep. But the quiet didn't last long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a noise. A soft, rhythmic thumping sound. It took me a moment to realize it was coming from the wall behind the bed. 3 soft knocks, followed by silence. My eyes snapped open, and I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just the old building settling. But the knocks came again. 3, precise and deliberate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The knocks had stopped, but the silence that followed was suffocating. Every hair on my body was standing on end, and the room felt colder than before. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 3:07 a.m. Of course. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving just outside the door. My heart pounded in my chest as the footsteps grew louder, stopping right outside my room. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence. Then, without warning, the door handle began to jiggle. Just a little at first, as if someone was testing it, trying to see if it was locked. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, as I watched the handle twist slowly back and forth. Finally, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading down the hall until there was nothing left but the pounding of my own heartbeat. I wanted to get up, to check the door, but fear kept me glued to the bed. I told myself it was just another guest, someone who had gotten lost or confused. but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, wide-eyed, listening for any sound, any sign that the footsteps would return. But they never did. At sunrise, I packed my things in a hurry and rushed downstairs to check out. The receptionist from the night before was gone, replaced by a younger guy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. I debated telling him about what had happened, but I didn't want to sound like a lunatic. So instead, I just handed him the key and muttered something about a restless night. As I turned to leave, though, I couldn't resist asking, "Is there anything weird about room 307? The guy looked up from his phone, frowning slightly. "Room 307? That room's been closed for years. No one's supposed to be in there." I stared at him, my stomach twisting into knots. "But I stayed there last night." He shook his head, his expression turning serious. "That can't be right. We haven't rented that room out since the incident." "What incident?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The guy hesitated, glancing around as if he wasn't sure he should be telling me this. Finally, he leaned in a little closer and said, "A guest died in that room about 10 years ago. Found him in the bed, heart attack, they said. But ever since then, weird stuff's been happening. Guests hear voices, see shadows. That's why we don't use it anymore." I left the hotel without another word. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the knocks, and the door handle. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just overtired. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone in that room. Story 4. The Night Manager. I had been on the road for about 8 hours straight when I finally decided to stop. The interstate was long and monotonous, and the only thing keeping me from falling asleep at the wheel was a mixture of caffeine and sheer willpower. It was well past midnight, and the idea of sleeping in my car for another night seemed unbearable. I needed a bed, just for a few hours, enough to feel human again. After scrolling through my phone for the nearest motel, I found a place that didn't look completely run down. It was called the Pines Lodge, and according to my GPS, it was only about 20 minutes off the highway. I didn't bother reading the reviews. I just needed a roof over my head. The road leading to the lodge wound through dense woods, the kind of darkness that made your headlights feel completely inadequate. The further I drove, the more the trees seemed to close in on me, their twisted branches looming over the road like skeletal arms. My phone's signal cut out just as I arrived at the motel. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted to get inside and sleep. The Pines Lodge wasn't much to look at. One of those single-story motels with a faded sign out front, and just a handful of cars in the lot. It had that old-fashioned look, with wood paneling that had long since lost its shine and flickering neon lights. A vacancy sign buzzed weakly in the front window. I parked, grabbed my overnight bag, and headed toward the lobby. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit by a wave of nostalgia. It was like stepping into the 1970s, with wood-paneled walls, worn carpet, and old-fashioned lamps casting a dim, yellow glow. The place smelled faintly of stale cigarettes and mildew. The front desk was empty. I rang the bell and waited, listening to the distant hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. After a minute or so, a man emerged from a back room. He was older, probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and a face that looked like it had seen more than its fair share of long nights. "Late check-in, huh?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah, just looking for a room for the night," I replied, setting my bag down. He handed me a form to fill out, his movement slow and deliberate. As I scribbled down my information, I noticed him watching me a little too closely. It wasn't in a creepy way exactly, but there was something unsettling about the way his eyes lingered, like he was sizing me up. "You're in room 12, he said after I handed him the form. "Just down the hall. Checkout's at 11. I nodded and took the key from him. A real key, not a card, with the number 12 engraved on a brass tag. I thanked him and made my way to the room, feeling his eyes on my back the entire time. Room 12 was at the far end of the building. The hallway was dimly lit, and the air felt thick, almost oppressive. As I passed by the other rooms, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But when I glanced over my shoulder, the hallway was empty. The door to my room creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room itself was small and sparse, with a bed, a nightstand, and a TV that looked like it hadn't worked in years. The walls were covered in that same wood paneling from the lobby, and there was an old, musty smell that clung to the air. The window was covered by thick curtains that blocked out any trace of moonlight. I dropped my bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to care about the state of the room. The mattress was lumpy, the sheets thin, and the pillows felt like they were stuffed with rocks. But I didn't care. All I needed was a few hours of sleep before getting back on the road. I must have dozed off pretty quickly, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound. It was faint at first, a soft scratching noise coming from somewhere in the room. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there in the dark, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was coming from the wall behind the bed. I sat up slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The noise stopped, leaving behind an unsettling silence. I listened intently, waiting for it to start again, but there was nothing, just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I told myself it was probably just a mouse or something. Old buildings like this were bound to have pests, but even as I tried to rationalize it, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, and tried to fall asleep again. But just as I started to drift off, the scratching started again. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It wasn't a mouse. It couldn't be. I bolted upright, my pulse racing. The sound was coming from the wall directly behind me, as if something, or someone, was trying to get through. I stared at the wall, my mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. And then I heard it. Something else, mixed in with the scratching. A voice. Faint but unmistakable. It was coming from inside the wall. "Help me!" I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was muffled, but I could hear the desperation in it. It wasn't the kind of voice you'd imagine in a nightmare. It sounded real. For a long moment, I just sat there, paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to get up, throw open the door, and run out of that motel as fast as I could. But another part of me, the part that was too curious for its own good, wanted to know more. "Help me, please." The voice was louder now, more urgent. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Slowly, I got out of bed and approached the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I pressed my ear to the wood paneling, listening. "Please." I jumped back as the wall thudded, as if something had hit it from the other side. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the cold sweat dripping down my back. Before I could think about what I was doing, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The narrow beam of light illuminated the wall, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I knelt down and examined the base of the wall, looking for any sign of where the noise could be coming from. And that's when I saw it. A small, almost imperceptible crack in the wood paneling, just wide enough to fit a finger through. I hesitated, my mind racing with every horror movie cliché I'd ever seen. But something compelled me to reach out, to touch the crack. The moment my fingers brushed the edge, the wall shook violently, and the voice screamed, "Help me!" I stumbled backward, dropping my phone in the process. The light flickered as it hit the ground, casting strange, dancing shadows on the ceiling. I scrambled to pick it up, my heart racing as the voice continued to scream from behind the wall. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The room fell into an eerie, oppressive silence. I stood there, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the chair by the window, my eyes glued to the wall, waiting for the scratching to start again. But it never did. When the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, I grabbed my bag and left without even checking out. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the motel shrinking in the distance. I swore I'd never stop at a place like that again. But even now, months later, I can still hear that voice sometimes. Late at night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear it. Help me. I continued driving, but the events of that night stayed with me. I'm not sure how much of it was real. Maybe it was just the tricks of an exhausted mind. Or maybe that motel really did hold the terrifying ghosts of the past. Story 5. The Room with No View. It was midnight when I finally arrived at my hotel after a long business trip out of town. Exhausted and drained, all I wanted was to get to my room and sleep. The receptionist greeted me warmly. "Looks like it's been a long journey," she said, glancing at my luggage. As I looked around the reception area, I noticed that the hotel was old but well kept. It had a vintage charm, like a typical boutique hotel, worn down but elegant in its own way. I grabbed my room key and headed to the elevator. The elevator creaked and groaned as it ascended, which made me feel uneasy. But I dismissed it as a side effect of being overtired. When the doors slowly opened, I was greeted by a long, dimly lit hallway. The faded yellow lights on the walls gave the place an eerie atmosphere. I walked toward room 312 and unlocked the door. The room was fairly unremarkable. Standard hotel fare. A double bed, an old-fashioned television, and a small desk. But something was missing. A window. Yes, there was no window in the room. I found it strange, but was too tired to care. I tossed my luggage in the corner and collapsed onto the bed. I fell asleep almost immediately. Sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up. The room was pitch black, but something felt off. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I sat up in bed, listening. The air seemed thick, like something was looming in the darkness. I reached for the lamp on the bedside table, but before I could turn it on, I heard a faint sound, like breathing. It wasn't my own. I froze. The sound was coming from the corner of the room where I'd left my suitcase. It was steady, rhythmic breathing. I held my breath, hoping I was just imagining things, but the noise persisted. Someone, or something, was in the room with me. Heart pounding, I quickly switched on the lamp. The room was empty. I stared at the corner where I had heard the sound, but there was nothing. My suitcase was where I had left it, and there was no sign of anyone else. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Unable to sleep, I sat up in bed, staring at the dark corners of the room. Minutes passed like hours, and that same suffocating feeling returned. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. That's when I noticed something truly strange. The walls seemed closer than before. It was as if the room was shrinking. I bolted out of bed and ran to the door. When I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside, but I hadn't locked it. Panic surged through me as I tugged at the door, desperate to get out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lock gave way, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't return to the room. Instead, I spent the rest of the night sitting in the hotel lobby, wide awake and shaken. When morning came, I approached the receptionist and explained what had happened. She looked at me with a knowing expression. "You're not the first person to leave room 312 in the middle of the night," she said quietly. "That room used to have a window. It was bricked up years ago after a guest, well, after something happened. They say you can still hear him breathing in there." I left the hotel that morning, never looking back. And to this day, I can't shake the memory of that breathing in the darkness in the room with no view. Story 6. The Phantom Suite. I had always been a skeptic when it came to paranormal stories. Ghosts, spirits, haunted hotels. They were all just products of overactive imaginations, or so I thought. That was until I booked a stay at a hotel that would change my perspective forever. It was supposed to be a simple business trip. I had a conference in a small town about 2 hours outside of the city, and the company had booked me a room at one of the more luxurious hotels in the area, a charming historical building that had once been a grand estate. The hotel was called the Evergreen Inn, and it had a reputation for its old-world charm, impeccable service, and luxurious rooms. I arrived in the late afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The hotel looked even more magnificent in the golden light, its ivy-covered walls and antique architecture giving it an almost magical appearance. As I checked in, the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, handed me my room key and said, "You're in the Phantom Suite, one of our finest rooms." "Phantom Suite?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She laughed lightly. "It's just a name, nothing to be concerned about. Some guests have claimed to have unusual experiences in that room, but it's mostly just rumors. I'm sure you'll be perfectly comfortable." I nodded, not thinking much of it at the time. I'd stayed in old hotels before, and they often had quirky names for their rooms. I took the elevator up to the 3rd floor and found my way down the hall to room 308, the Phantom Suite. The room was breathtaking. It was large, with high ceilings and a massive 4-poster bed that looked like something out of a fairy tale. There was a marble fireplace in one corner, and antique furniture filled the space, making it feel like I had stepped back in time. The windows offered a stunning view of the sprawling gardens below, now bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. I unpacked my bags and decided to freshen up before dinner. The bathroom was equally luxurious, with a clawfoot bathtub and ornate fixtures. After a quick shower, I changed and headed down to the hotel's restaurant for a meal. The food was exquisite, and by the time I returned to my room, it was well after dark. As I entered the suite, I noticed that the air felt different, heavier almost. The room was just as I had left it, but there was an undeniable chill in the air, despite the warm evening outside. I shrugged it off, assuming the old building was just drafty, and got ready for bed. It didn't take long before I began to hear strange noises. At first, it was just soft creaking, like the old wood settling, but then it grew louder. Footsteps, or at least that's what it sounded like. I paused, listening intently. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside my room. I figured it was another guest, perhaps returning late from dinner, but when I glanced at the door, the small crack of light beneath it showed no shadows passing by. I tried to ignore it, pulling the blankets up to my chin and closing my eyes, but the footsteps continued. They seemed to be getting closer, almost as if they were right outside my door. My heart began to race. I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was in this large old hotel. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe it was the building itself. Old structures made all sorts of noises, right? But then, as I lay there, I heard the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning. My eyes shot open, and I stared at the door, waiting for it to open, for someone to step inside. But nothing happened. The handle stopped moving, and the room fell silent again. I sat up in bed, my pulse pounding in my ears. This was ridiculous. There had to be a logical explanation. I got up and cautiously walked to the door, checking to see if it was still locked. It was. I even tugged on it to make sure. Satisfied that no one could have entered, I turned to head back to bed. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the foot of the bed. It was only there for a second, a flicker of movement in the dark, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through my body. I froze, staring at the spot where I had seen it. But the figure was gone. Had I imagined it? Was I so tired that my mind was playing tricks on me? I slowly backed away, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. My hand fumbled for the light switch, and when I finally managed to turn it on, the room was empty. No shadowy figure, no intruder, just the same luxurious room, now bathed in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was watching me, standing just out of sight. The next morning, I packed my bags and left the hotel as quickly as I could. Before I checked out, I mentioned the strange events to the receptionist. She gave me a sympathetic look and said, "You're not the first guest to experience something unusual in the Phantom Suite. It's said that the original owner of the estate still lingers in that room. He doesn't like it when people stay in his bed." I left the Evergreen Inn that day, never to return. But the memory of that night in the Phantom Suite still haunts me. I've stayed in countless hotels since then, but I'll never forget the cold, unsettling feeling of being watched by something that wasn't quite human. Story 7. The Haunting of Room 214. As a freelance travel writer, I've stayed in my fair share of hotels, each with their own charm and quirks. But nothing could prepare me for the eerie experience I had at a quaint hotel tucked away in a small, unassuming town. It was called the Whispering Pines Inn, and it had a reputation for its rustic beauty and tranquility. Little did I know, it also held a darker secret within its walls. I arrived at the inn just before sunset. The building was an old Victorian house, beautifully maintained with a wraparound porch adorned with rocking chairs and potted plants. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled my lungs as I stepped inside. The lobby was warm and inviting, decorated with vintage furniture and an impressive collection of old photographs depicting the hotel in its early days. As I checked in, the receptionist, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes, handed me the key to room 214. "It's a lovely room with a beautiful view of the forest," she said. However, her expression changed slightly as she added, "Just be mindful of the history. Room 214 has seen a few unusual events over the years." I chuckled lightly, dismissing her words as just another ghost story. I was there to enjoy a peaceful retreat, not to get spooked. After a long drive, I was eager to relax, so I thanked her and headed up to my room. Room 214 was located at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. As I entered, I was greeted by a cozy atmosphere, soft lighting, a plush queen-size bed, and large windows that overlooked the dense forest. I dropped my bags and took a moment to enjoy the view, admiring the way the setting sun bathed the trees in golden light. After settling in, I decided to explore the inn. I wandered through the common areas, which were filled with the scent of freshly baked cookies wafting from the kitchen. The other guests were friendly, and we exchanged stories over coffee and pastries. But there was something unsettling about the inn that I couldn't quite put my finger on. A sense of being watched, perhaps. That night, after a delightful dinner and a few glasses of wine, I returned to my room, feeling warm and content. I turned on the television, but after flipping through channels without finding anything interesting, I decided to call it a night. I set my alarm and turned off the lights, sinking into the soft sheets of the bed. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound that sent chills down my spine. A soft, whispering voice. It was faint, almost like a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves, but it was unmistakable. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The voice seemed to be calling my name, luring me out of the safety of my blankets. "Emma." I blinked, my heart racing. I looked around the room, but the darkness enveloped everything. Was I imagining it? I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, but the whispering continued. "Emma, come play with me." Panic gripped me. The voice sounded so real, so close. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I grabbed my phone to use as a flashlight and slowly made my way to the door. I opened it cautiously, peering into the hallway. It was empty, but the whispering continued, echoing off the walls. It seemed to be coming from the staircase at the end of the corridor. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the better of me. I followed the sound, tiptoeing down the hallway, the old wooden floorboards creaking under my weight. As I reached the staircase, the whispering became clearer. It felt as if it was beckoning me to descend. I gripped the railing and started down the stairs, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back. The air grew colder as I descended, and I could see faint shadows dancing in the flickering light of the sconces along the walls. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a dimly lit parlor filled with antique furniture. The whispering grew louder, echoing around me. "Emma! Where are you?" It felt intimate yet terrifying, like an invisible presence was just out of sight. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its surface clouded with age. Something compelled me to approach it, the whispers now urging me forward. I stared into the mirror, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing behind me. A little girl with long, tangled hair and a pale face, her eyes wide and pleading. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the empty room, silent now except for my own breath. My instincts kicked in, and I turned to flee back to my room. The whispers faded into the background as I sprinted up the stairs, the feeling of dread amplifying with each step I took. I locked the door behind me, my heart pounding in my chest. I collapsed onto the bed, trembling. The reality of what just happened sank in, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. I had to be dreaming. I had to be. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded me. Hours passed in silence until the first light of dawn broke through the curtains. I could hardly bring myself to face the day, but I knew I had to check out. I gathered my things and headed downstairs, avoiding the parlor where I had heard the whispers. As I approached the receptionist to check out, she noticed my disheveled appearance. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a knowing smile. I hesitated, wondering if I should share my experience. Instead, I simply nodded and paid my bill. As I turned to leave, she called out to me. "Be careful in room 214, dear. Many guests have felt her presence. They say she just wants someone to play with." I shuddered, recalling the whispers. "What happened to her?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. The receptionist's expression softened. "She was a little girl who stayed here long ago. She got lost in the woods near the inn and never returned. Some believe her spirit still wanders the hotel, searching for a friend." I left the Whispering Pines Inn with a heavy heart, haunted by the experience and the memory of that ghostly voice calling my name. While I never returned to the inn, I often wonder about the little girl, and what might have happened if I had followed her whispers a little longer. Was it just a figment of my imagination, or was I truly beckoned by a spirit yearning for companionship? To this day, I remain a skeptic, but a part of me knows that some places carry their stories. Stories that linger long after the guests have checked out. Thank you for watching. I hope these 7 scary hotel stories sent shivers down your spine. If you enjoyed this type of content, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Which story affected you the most? Until next time, take care.